Why is no one talking about the show? As you may know, my mic decided to die on me a few weeks ago, which meant that I had a lot of free time. So what do? Find a short series to watch, of course. So I came across Moriarty the Patriot. The poster looked cool, the first sentence of the synopsis seemed interesting, so off I went. But there was something bugging me. Moriarty. Where had I heard that before? And then, no more than 30 seconds later, I realized. This is a Sherlock Holmes story. If you had seen the smirk on my face at that moment, it was priceless. When I was younger, I absolutely loved the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, so right away, I knew I was in for a good time. Thankfully, my memory was quite hazy from back then, so I was ready to see this interpretation of the classic story. Right away, I want to look at the opening for a little bit, because I absolutely loved it. The sun sets over London, and we see Moriarty himself with his blood-red eyes, which then cuts to the scene of his allies looking over the city in the night. Now, I may be reading into this a little too much, but there's the scene of the nobles dancing, or I guess you could call it a play of death, and ignoring the pool of blood with the white flower within it, which is followed by a scene of a woman being murdered, symbolizing how the higher up members of society are only concerned with their own well-being, as Moriarty just burns the whole thing down, just as he's trying to do with the aristocratic system. That is then transitioned to Sherlock, who is overlaid with those endless strings he's trying to pull together, which culminates in him and Moriarty holding each other at gunpoint. I don't think this needs to be elaborated on further. This is very much a cat and mouse game. And finally, of course, the obligatory murder of crows flying with the blood moon over London. Okay, I know we're barely 3 minutes into the very first episode, but I want to talk about the very next opening shots. Often London in the 19th century is portrayed purely through the aristocratic point of view, which is obviously what the series is going against. So instead of the bright parties with fancy dresses, London is portrayed in the dead of night with a blood-red fog, with a lantern desperately trying to pierce it. This immediately sets the tone that this is not a pleasant place. We follow a boy as he runs. We don't yet know why, but it's clear that he is running for his life, as he is overlooked by these gothic gargoyle statues. Just as he thinks he has gotten away, he is taken, as this angel statue does not imply the purity it usually does, as this time it is an angel of death. If this does not set the tone flawlessly, then I really don't know what will. Right after this tension-filled moment, there's a sudden transition to a much brighter and more peaceful scene. The juxtaposition here is very much intentional, of course. The brilliant thing about the very next couple of scenes is that if you're going in complete evil mastermind. So, after this exposition shows you that he is extremely intelligent and able to pick up on the smallest of clues, you would be forgiven for thinking that he is actually a master detective. And this is why I likened it to Death Note. The hook of the series happens as soon as 6 minutes in. We see Moriarty put together the puzzle after a mere few minutes. And again, so far, this looks like a detective, not a criminal mastermind, right? We'll talk about this a little more later, but the following scene of Albert entering the store and talking to the tailor shows you another thing that this show does brilliantly, flipping the tone on its head. We just saw the deduction that Moriarty does. It is emotionless, cold, and calculated, which is then flipped upside down once the tailor speaks of his murdered son, and his hidden thoughts shine as the gargoyles in the crimson fog appear once again. After they carry out their plan, London is once again dark and covered in a thick fog. Only this time, it is bleak and grey, only highlighted by the piercing red lights as Moriarty rides a carriage pulled by a black horse. The visuals here are just brilliant. And now for this next scene, I may be reading into it a little too much again, but I absolutely love the color theory part of the show and how they use saturation to carry a deeper message. Moriarty's eyes are always that signature blood red. Now the way I would interpret this is that his actions are just unambiguously evil. While his goal may be somewhat understandable, his actions are not by any stretch. Now you can of course bring up the whole greater good argument, but at the end of the day, he is single-handedly deciding whether these people are worthy or not. I don't particularly want to get into this discussion for this video, but if you think that his actions are justifiable, there's still plenty of concerns as to where you draw the line, etc. But moving on. Whereas the tailor's eyes are blue. He's a good man. But that red necktie. Evil has him by his throat as he carries out this act of vengeance. After it is said and done, the color intensity is gone. And in a almost picturesque manner, the sun rises over London once again. But we'll talk about the color theory part and how they play around with saturation a little bit more later. Now, episode 2 and 3 is genuinely just a masterclass in storytelling. The way all the different timelines are interwoven to tell you how this family even ended up here, and the dark story behind Moriarty and his brother is just perfect. Also, I think the placement of these episodes is something that you don't really see often. We get the hook of episode 1 where the premise is clearly outlined and the characters are introduced. But instead of leaving this mystique for, let's say, a season finale where something dramatic happens and we get the explanation of how Moriarty came to be, it is done right away in episode 2, while he is just telling the story to a man on the train. And again, we get that jumping around between events, which made for a very gripping origin story. As for a few more things in this particular episode, I love the tainted visuals from Albert's point of view. Like when he looked at the family photos and there were just these black blobs of corruption. But then again, the blood moon rises as the plan is carried out. And the theme, oh my. I'd play it for you, but I'd get blasted by good old YouTube. In the next episode, I just want to point out this little scene that I absolutely loved. It's pretty much the culmination of the episode. By this point, you already expect that this guy won't see the light of day again. So this whole scene is already very intense, even with the whole peaceful nature. But then, that music that is just slightly off kicks in, and you know it's about to go down. The woman is cutting the grapefruits, and then there's the snap. The crimson overlay and the theme signals that the murderous intent is here. And just like that, we 180. And for a second, you would be forgiven for thinking that Moriarty isn't actually playing into this. But of course, this is all but a mere play. Once again, the grey is contrasted with Moriarty's piercing red eyes as he explains the plan. Episode 6 is of course when things get really interesting. First things first, keep this opening of the hunt in mind. But now we get into Moriarty's bigger schemes, as well as a rival for Moriarty. Now, in hindsight, don't ask me how I didn't realize this was Sherlock. I mean, who else could it be, right? But their very first exchange was just great. The way they just tried to one-up each other with their smarts was really fun to see. But moving on to episode 7, the second part of this scheme. Few things to mention in this episode. We start to see glimpses of how Sherlock may prove to be worrisome for Moriarty, as he leaps onto the stage and immediately realizes that there's some fishy business going on. But the very next scene, remember how I told you to remember the opening of the hunt? This time, of course, it is flipped, as the hunter now becomes the hunted. Yeah, I know this is a small detail, but this is just what makes these shows for me. I absolutely love those little attentions to detail. After the scheme is complete, we cut back to Moriarty at his home, with him explaining that he had another conversation with Sherlock right after getting off the ship. This time, Sherlock just lays out what he found out about the body to Moriarty, and the dynamic between them is already starting to show itself. While not directly said, Moriarty obviously sees this almost as a challenge, as in his mind, this was still the perfect crime. Yes, Sherlock could find some flaws here and there, but there was nothing linking him to the crime. Oh, and as I mentioned, my stupid little brain still hadn't picked up on the fact that this was Sherlock. So him saying that he is Holmes gave me the biggest stupid smirk ever. Alright, episode 8. This one is really big in a few ways. This one is exclusively a Sherlock episode, mostly focusing on the introduction of Dr. Watson. But the most important part of this episode, one of the very first scenes. So far, we've always described Moriarty's crimes as essentially perfect, right? Well, that is always on the assumption that this is the 19th century. Things like advanced forensics do not exist. So yeah, in this day and age, they are indeed perfect crimes. However, once Sherlock comes into the picture, that will change. And this scene shows us that. Sherlock has developed this new agent that only reacts in the presence of blood, allowing him to draw out the tiniest particles dating back months. While this in and of itself is not enough to discount Moriarty's genius, it is slowly starting to show you that in the day of modern science, schemes like this are far more difficult, if not impossible, to get away with. This is a part of the show that I also really like. Unlike some detective shows where you can clearly say how the crime could be solved almost straight away using forensics, that's not really the case here, as science has simply not reached that point. In this historical period, it's mostly down to the person's wits and not much else, making these crimes, for all intents and purposes, indeed perfect. Anyway, skipping ahead to episode 9, the confrontation between Sherlock and the perpetrator of the crime. Again, the obligatory murder of crows watching on from the distance. But here, as it turns out, this whole thing was yet another scheme put together to test Sherlock. This of course also shows us, the viewer, how Holmes approaches these problems. Yes, he could have bent the rules and gotten the answer as to who the crime lord really is, but he does not. The act of solving the puzzle is the thrill itself, even if it is next to impossible. Though, when I was first watching this, something else came into my mind, so indulge me with a little bit of theory. Think of Moriarty. Wouldn't it kind of be in his best interest to get rid of Sherlock, his judgment? Maybe getting the answer here is worth it. In the very next episode, while fighting with the consequences of his decision, he does indeed pull the trigger. So, what if Dr. Watson is the unaccounted for variable in Moriarty's plan? Remember how Watson told Sherlock that he only wishes that he uses his brain for good? What if this is the sentence that changed his mind that night? If this theoretical plan of Moriarty's went through, Holmes would have shot the perpetrator and would have been incarcerated, putting an end to the one and only person who could possibly catch Moriarty. Again, he is a genius, but there is no way he could have predicted or calculated for Watson's appearance. So maybe, just maybe, that was the original plan. But you know, just an idea. We then enter the final act of season 1, or I guess part 1, I don't know what to call these nowadays. And this works to show us how different these two characters are. Episode 10 begins with Sherlock fighting his case where Holmes surprisingly runs into Moriarty. What follows is one of the best scenes in the show so far in my opinion. Moriarty is obviously already aware of his feats, even saying that he has read about him in the newspaper. The music in the background then becomes this much more tense and almost confrontational beat. For a moment, we get Lewis's inner dialogue and how he's a tad worried about Sherlock showing up here. Holmes and Moriarty then continue to have a conversation about his theory that there is a mastermind behind all of this, the implications of which are obviously massive. Then, silence. And Holmes cold calls Moriarty as being the mastermind. Right away we cut to Lewis's inner dialogue again, who starts piecing together whether this is a bluff or not. Moriarty's features are quite distinct after all. There are not many professors who are that young, and such a cold call out of the blue seems absolutely insane. He even contemplates ending him then and there. But Moriarty breaks the silence by blatantly telling him, "Well, wouldn't it be your job to prove it then?" Sherlock proceeds to laugh it off and say that it was all just a joke. Moriarty then proceeds to play up the evil mastermind role by saying,
"Catch me if you can, Mr. Holmes."
But let's step back for a moment. We, as the third party here, already have all the information. We've seen Sherlock's deductive abilities already. So was this really just a joke? Could it have actually been a way of catching Moriarty out? This absolutely blind call seems crazy, and I can't help but think that Holmes has already zeroed in on Moriarty. But anyway, moving on to the case at hand. We find out that there has been a murder on the train, one in which Moriarty is not actually involved. They of course decide to have a competition of who finds the guilty person first, and so they go on their own ways of solving the crime. But remember what I said about how this case shows us how different these two characters are. Both are clearly extremely intelligent, and both of their deductive abilities are amazing. But there is one major difference between the two. Moriarty is willing to bend the rules to get what he wants. Both Sherlock and Moriarty already know who the guilty person is, but Holmes can't do anything without proof. Moriarty, on the other hand, is willing to fabricate evidence if it means getting what he wants. In this case, it is the blood mark he leaves on each and every person, just in case. But again, think back to what I said about these being perfect crimes. In the modern context, they are not. Fabricating evidence and even leaving behind your own trace does not fly nowadays. And remember how we saw Sherlock already start the use of forensics. Certainly interesting for the future, is it not? Also, perhaps a little unrelated, but I can't wait to see the show dubbed. If they don't get some British voice actors with super posh accents, I will be forever disappointed. This is the perfect show and the perfect opportunity for the dub to have the edge of it being set right there in London. But to wrap things up, why do I think this is the spiritual successor of Death Note? Obviously the world is very different, there is no magical notebook and so on. But the story themes are so similar. It is a clash of two great minds where both are fighting for what they view as true justice. It brings up the same questions about whether Moriarty's actions can somehow be justified, or whether he is simply a product of his surroundings. It delves deep into the aristocratic society and explores just how twisted it really is. How some can live in absolute luxury while the other half is barely getting by. There is really a number of conversations to be had around this show, and with season 2, or again part 2, starting a few weeks ago, some massive things are being set up, with Moriarty now no longer hiding his personality and using it as a way of leverage and so on. Either way, I am sure we will be revisiting the series at some point. The only question I still have is how far will this story go? Because even though my memory is quite hazy of the original tale, I do remember that it ends with a particularly interesting detail. But I'll let you find that out on your own. And that brings us to the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did. Suppose in a weird way, my mic deciding to die was indeed a blessing, as I ended up binging this when I would normally be editing or working on future videos. Speaking of which, if all goes as planned, next video will be embarking on a very special adventure that will likely last for quite some time. But that's still yet to come. As usual, all the social media links are below, and other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.